Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another webinar by Rowley Turton, which we do every couple of months on subjects which we think will interest our clients, perhaps those who aren't yet clients but might be in the future. I have been a financial advisor of one sort or another for about 30 years, and at that time I've seen governments come and go, and goodness knows how many prime ministers, and even more chancellors of the exchequer. And every time there's a change, there is fevered speculation by us and people in our field about quite what this time these changes are going to bring. And it gets quite intense, but normally afterwards we find we were completely wrong and it dies down again. Now, that's not to say there aren't important things that do change. Governments change rules a lot, especially on things like pensions and investments that affect us more than anything. But over the long term, over the last 30 years, certainly, no matter the ups and downs, I've noticed that people still pay their mortgages, build for retirement, send their children to university, and the world continues on. And from an investment point of view, which is something that we do a lot of, we find that investments tend to keep on going up, whatever the ups and downs and trials and tribulations along the way. So in terms of what the latest changes will bring, we know there's an election very, very soon. If you're not sick of it already, you soon will be. We don't know quite what is going to be around the corner, but we've got some pretty good ideas now, and some of you would like to have some of those ideas in advance. So my colleague Scott Gallagher is about to take you through what we know and what we think about the changes, and hopefully put you in a better position to think about what lies ahead. Before I introduce Scott, he is a director of Rowley Turton. He is a chartered financial advisor of many years standing, and he'll be talking to you about the election upcoming. Before that, here's the agenda. A little bit of housekeeping first. Your cameras are off and your microphones are on mute, so don't worry about that. There'll be questions and answers at the end. And at the end of this, a recording of the webinar will be available to everybody. We'll email you a copy, and at the same time, we'll ask you if you have any questions you'd like for us, and maybe invite you in for a cup of coffee and a biscuit to learn about what Rowley Turton do. So thank you for joining us today, and without further ado, I'll pass over to my colleague Scott, who will take you through what we think might be happening in a couple of weeks' time. Thank you very much.
Cheers. Thank you, Martin. Firstly, a small confession. When we started planning this seminar, it was actually in advance of Rishi Sunak's announcement of the election. And to be honest, we thought we would be doing it at this time of year, but in terms of a future Labour government coming in at the end of the year or in the new year. And we're quite surprised. If you look at the polling here, Labour have been, consistently, on above 40%, for a year or so. And so we're quite surprised that he chose to call the election when he did. There's been a slight fallback in Labour's polling over the last couple of days, really, or a few days. But also that's coincided with a fall in the Conservatives' own share, and to some extent it's down to the surge of reform and Nigel Farage's return to frontline politics. So I think it's safe to say that Rishi Sunak's election campaign has not gone well, and I think almost everyone would agree with that, or certainly not disagree. I think with the polling, and I say the numerous polls, but it's fairly consistent. So barring some amazing rabbit out of a hat in the next week or so, I think it's change is almost guaranteed. I think it's fair to say that we are looking at a new Labour government, which some people will welcome and some people won't. I think to start by looking at kind of governments in the sense of one of the key things, certainly from a financial planning perspective, is how governments of any colour balance the books. So there's normally 5 key elements that they talk about: tax and spending, and we certainly see that politicians have, well, at the moment, if we look at Sunak, they'll make a big deal about Labour's tax plans and whether they make up and whether there's going to be more tax for people. Spending, traditionally, the Conservatives, the party, are spending less and having less tax, and Labour typically the party of having higher tax and higher spending, and a trade-off between whether you think which is better for you or for the country. All politicians, regardless of colour, will talk about efficiency, savings, and tax avoidance and benefits cheats as a way of raising money or saving money. I'll be honest, I think they're kind of magical unicorns, really. That's not to say that organisations like the NHS aren't inefficient. I'm sure there are inefficiencies in any large organisation. Equally, I'm sure people do avoid tax, and I'm sure that some people cheat the benefit system. But as I say, almost every politician of almost every colour will claim that there's these magical savings to be made from attacking these areas. But if they were these fantastic savings, mostly they would have been achieved by now. I think they're just endemic in any kind of system. And then finally, we've got economic growth. If we're looking in terms of what Labour are talking about at the moment, their policies are actually, in a sense, very conservative with a small c. So their tax and spending commitments, even the Institute of Financial Studies, or Fiscal Studies, Financial Studies, IFS, have said that they are trivial in nature. So it's not a huge commitment. I think that's partly, well, I think largely a political decision on the basis that the Labour Party wants to be seen as financially prudent in order to be elected, regardless of polling results. And I think it's more akin to the Blair government, certainly in the first few years of the Blair government, when they committed to maintaining largely the Conservative governments or previous governments' tax and spend policies. And it's certainly not a Corbyn-esque Labour Party. So I think there's not too much scary in the manifesto on tax and spending. That said, Labour seem to be pinning a lot of their longer term spending goals or aspirations on economic growth, and they have some good ideas behind that, I think it's fair to say. However, as I'll show in a moment, I'm skeptical of government's ability to really drive economic growth. I think economic growth is to some extent something that happens in countries, provided that the government kind of doesn't get too much in the way. But we'll have a look at that in a moment. I've not mentioned borrowing specifically, because neither Labour or Conservatives really want to talk about borrowing more, but also because where we are in terms of debt, then it's not, I think for either party, it wouldn't be viewed as financially prudent to be looking to borrow more money. That's not to say that they won't have to borrow more money, almost whoever wins. I think the IFS have accused both Labour and Conservative parties of being a conspiracy of silence about the real state of the finances, but we'll work on what we've got and I'll come on to that. So one of the things I think it's fair to point out is that despite the Conservatives traditionally being the party of lower tax, we're currently in a very high tax regime. It's technically fallen back a little bit. So we're previously at a 70-year high. It's not quite that level. It's just fallen back a little bit, albeit the predictions and the IFS have done this for both, actually for Labour and Conservative. They are similar. I will admit that Labour's are slightly higher, but there's not a huge difference in terms of the likely tax revenue as a share of GDP. And you can see from this chart, we had a low of 28% in the end of the 50s and almost got there in the kind of early 90s, but now we're 37%, give or take. So we're certainly in a high tax environment. So I think Labour's potential to increase taxes is somewhat limited or constrained anyway, which might be, well, it's not good that we're in a high tax environment, that's very, very certain to say, but I think it's probably reassuring to certainly our clients that, there's, in our view, there isn't too much higher that taxes can go. Now, I mentioned about economic growth. So one of the things we've done is, sourced economic growth by party. So essentially, very simple, red lines are when Labour Party was in charge and it's essentially GDP growth. Blue lines are when the Conservative Party were in power. Now, on one hand, a quick look at it, you might say that it's a bit better under the Conservatives than under Labour. However, when you drill down through all the numbers, it's statistically not significant. There's three negatives. Brown, who gets the blame for the global financial crisis, probably a bit unfairly, big negative there. There's a major with the recession, when arguably it's arguments whether he actually wanted to be in charge of that period or not. And then Wilson, previously. The other argument, or one of the, I suppose, challenges with economic growth by party is when do you take responsibility for any negative investment economic growth or recession stuff, and when you take credit for success, because largely the economy grows. So one of the ways that economists, etc., look at this is by what's called a lagging thing. So what they do is when Labour, assume they win the next election, they will take a while for them to introduce their policies and for those policies to have an effect on the real economy. The growth that they get the first week, month after they come in will not be down to anything they've done. It will be down to what the Conservatives, good or bad, did previously. So the way they do this is by a lagging indication. So what you do is essentially you move the growth figures, good or bad, back to the previous government. And you can do that either not at all or maybe up to 8 quarters, 2 years, to give an indication about average GDP growth by party. I think it's quite a good way of doing that. What you actually see if you do that is the economic growth. The Conservatives is fractionally more, but fundamentally it's in the same ballpark and fundamentally it's positive. So to some extent, my interpretation of that is that no matter who's in charge, and Labour and Conservative generally have different policies at different periods in history, it doesn't make a huge difference in terms of who's running the country in that sense. I think these figures are from 1955, but if anyone actually needs the dates, I can dig that out for them. I mentioned earlier about Labour seems to be pinning a lot on economic growth. And I certainly think most people agree that economic growth has been a bit lacking in the UK recently, COVID and other factors. And obviously the idea of economic growth is that we grow the pie, as they will say. So there's a bigger pie and therefore we all get a share of that. So when it comes to funding, NHS, pensions, schools, etc., potholes, then there's a bigger pie to pay for it. So it's quite a sort of sensible policy. I've mentioned earlier, I'm questionable whether governments can really move that too much, but they would at least have a plan, I suppose. So firstly, they're talking about putting economic stability first. So talking about a charter for budget responsibility, essentially tasking the OBR to make sure the government sticks to certain plans. There are pros and cons to that. I think the aim is to kind of avoid a Liz Truss kind of style budget, so there's good benefits, but it can restrict governments. One of the things I do like is they talk about annual budgets rather than 6 monthly. Now, working in financial services, there's an element of a 6 monthly budget is exciting. Oh, what's the chance of going to do? But from a practical planning angle for ourselves and for our clients, it's a bit of a nightmare. We don't want tax rules and other, benefits, etc., spending commitments changing every 6 months. We'd rather certainty, and in business, you need certainty to plan. So the intention is an annual budget at the end of the year or beginning of the year, 4 months before the tax year, so that businesses can plan. And no corporation tax changes. I think businesses would welcome that, so certainly no increases, but that must be viewed in the knowledge that we're a relatively high corporation tax compared to recent history. So, essentially corporation tax went up. Labour are not increasing it, but they're not cutting it either. A national wealth fund, so investment in the country, that's obviously hopefully a good thing. In the Industrial Strategy Council, hopefully to get businesses and unions and council government to work together, sounds good. Planning reforms. Most governments mention planning reforms. Bit sceptical over this work. They plan to build, I think, another 1.5 million houses and other projects. In reality, that these things tend to fall down at local level because people don't necessarily want new houses being built next to their house. But if that does go through, that'd be obviously good for economic growth and construction work, etc. And then making work pay. I think this is a double-edged sword. They're talking about minimum wage reforms and basically removing some of the bans and putting people, saying which is obviously good for younger workers to earn more. It is a cost on business, additional workers' rights. Some argument about whether this is beneficial or negative if it stops employers hiring new people by making it riskier and more expensive. So I think swings and roundabouts on that point. The other thing to look at is obviously, growth, I've said, seems to be too influenced by who's in charge. So what about the stock market? So this is just the UK stock market, all share, I think. But essentially, the fundamental trend of the stock market is it goes up. Capital is at risk. You can lose money. Don't forget any of that. But actually, the party being in charge doesn't make too much of a difference, really. The general trend is upwards. And this is another thing. This is all share from, again, I think 1983, I think it is. So Conservative Labour governments. Conservative governments win almost 5% a year versus Labour on 4%, but they're still positive. Then none of this is negative, and there will be a million other factors, how the economy was doing at the time, various other things. And again, whether you inherited it at a good time, people will argue it. The fundamental principle is it's positive regardless of who is in charge. Now, tax changes. I said that the Labour's manifesto commitments, and generally most of what they're saying, is very conservative with a small c in terms of tax rises. So essentially what they've said is income tax, national insurance, VAT, apart from private school fees, and I'll mention that later, and corporation tax is fundamentally no change. So that's good news, albeit some of those might argue at a relatively high level anyway. So not coming down, but not going up. Probably, I haven't looked at fine detail, but almost an element of certain, an element of fiscal drag, i.e. frozen allowances will catch more people, which is governments of both colour do. I suspect that continues. There is some question marks over other taxes, and I think it depends on where you are in the political spectrum, I think. Labour's manifesto is very quiet, almost silent on capital gains tax, inheritance tax and other taxes. So they haven't committed to not increasing them. That said, if you listen to Labour, whenever they're challenged on this, they do make the point that all of their spending commitments in their manifesto are fully costed, so should be achievable without tax rises. So that would imply that they don't increase these taxes. But in the real world, the future is unknown. Maybe they don't get the growth they're hoping for, because that may be a bit optimistic, and maybe they have to rise those taxes. I read a Guardian article the other day, which had found an internal Labour document. I unfortunately didn't publish the internal document, so you couldn't quite see exactly what it was saying and how relevant it was, or whether it's just blue sky thinking. But some of the things that the Guardian article and that internal document looked at was increasing capital gains tax rates. There's a lot of criticism of capital gains tax in the sense that the rates are lower on capital gains than they are on income. So lots of talk of increasing those rates from 10 and 18, or sorry, 10 and 20%, or 18 and, sorry, 18 and 24 on property, to put them in line with income tax rates of 20, 40, 45, etc. And that would raise a lot of money for the government. And arguments for and against that. Obviously, for our clients, that would generally be a bad thing, but it's a point to bear in mind. Inheritance tax, similarly, there's been talk of removing some of the gifting provisions in a sense. So there's certain exempt assets you can own that if you own them for normally 2 years are exempt from inheritance tax. And so there's some argument about removing those allowances or exemptions. So again, if you've got an inheritance tax problem, maybe look at planning earlier. And then other taxes are insurance premium tax, fuel duty, other things that may or may not be specifically covered in the manifesto. So they're quiet on that. That's not to say that these will increase, but there is, the Labour Party have left themselves more political leeway to increase them if they needed to or wanted to do those. So investments and markets. This is again a big concern from our clients. What might happen to the the market and your investments in the event of a Labour government? Well, the first thing to say is, to a large extent, I don't think there will be much change. The stock market generally go up. It's the UK stock market. International markets, if you think about it, probably not too concerned about the UK government changing, or I don't know, Microsoft or Coca-Cola, a change in the UK government probably doesn't make much of a difference to you. So largely, I suspect there's no change, but people will be concerned about it. And more importantly, it's probably priced in already. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you think about it, investors are making decisions on a daily basis about whether to buy a share or an investment, or to sell that investment, or just to hold it. Now, investors, as a whole, obviously will make relatively informed and rational decisions on that. Now, we've seen the polling earlier that have had Labour at 40-odd% for at least a year. We know that there was an election this year or beginning of next year, so investors will know that it's likely that the government will change. So if the investors thought that their companies that they were buying were going to be adversely affected by that change, likely they would have sold those shares already. So it's in the share price. And this is the thing a lot of people with investments forget, that once something is kind of known, it's normally in share price. What stock markets and investments generally don't like is uncertainty. So some examples of that are sudden change. So this Trust mini budget, which was quite a radical departure from the budgets previously, that shocked the market and led to losses on equities and bonds. That was a big surprise. Hung Parliament in the 2010, Cameron and Clegg from memory, again, wasn't expected really. So again, uncertainty, who's going to be in charge? That's not good. Brexit referendum, result wasn't as perhaps predicted previously, so there was a fall in the pound and it has an impact. If it had gone, well, if Leave had been known to be winning before, the impact would have been less because it would have been priced in previously. So again, it surprises and uncertainty that investments don't like. Labour winning is probably not a surprise, and it's probably not uncertain. That said, if you are concerned about what might happen with a Labour government coming in, the things, certainly from an investment perspective, the things that clients normally will say to me is, well, okay, they worry about the pound falling. You know, they quote things of Labour in perhaps the 70s when perhaps financially things didn't go well. Again, I don't think that's likely to happen because I think this is a Starmer/Blair type government in a sense, not a Corbyn or a 70s Labour government, but it could happen. You never know, but I think it's unlikely. If it was to happen, well, in terms of the best places to be from an investment perspective is actually most of our clients will be fine because most of our clients have got a well-balanced, diversified, and more often than not, certainly more heavily weighted in terms of international assets. So the best way to look at it is if the pound falls because of change of government or government policy thereafter, then if you own, say, I don't know, a Spanish villa, and that Spanish villa is worth 200,000 euros, well, those 200,000 euros, if you were to sell the Spanish villa, because the price of the Spanish villa won't change, still be 200,000 euros, that would then buy more pounds because the pound has got cheaper. So in pound terms, your Spanish villa has gone up. Now, if you replace your Spanish villa with Microsoft and Coca-Cola shares, again, in pound terms, they go up. So what you would expect is there's a well-diversified investor with an international biased portfolio that you would actually profit from a falling pound. Equally, some UK larger companies that make their money primarily overseas, so oil companies, etc., their profits generally in dollars, those dollars would buy more pounds, so you would expect the share price of those companies go up. What might be affected is more UK-centric, smaller companies and UK-focused companies, which may be affected. So they're things to think about if you think that the pound might fall. Conversely, we've got the flip side of this. If the government finances do not go as the Labour Party hope, and I suppose in a sense we all hope they go well, then the government may have to borrow money. And with a high debt burden, they might have to increase interest rates to encourage people to lend money to them. A higher interest rate typically leads to people investing in the UK in terms of certainly putting their money on deposit and lending money to the UK government, and generally leads to a strengthening of the pound. So in that scenario, we actually get the reverse. Overseas assets in pound terms would fall. UK companies that have their earnings primarily overseas would be affected. UK companies or domestically focused companies might be okay, though the rising interest rates, a bit of a, I suppose, conflicting issue on this. But what might do well, retailers might do well because the cost of imports, because we've got a stronger pound, they would get cheaper. So it would make goods in the shops cheaper, hopefully. Things like travel companies might do well because the cost of your foreign holiday is suddenly cheaper. So they might be benefit from there. There's also then sector-specific issues. We've got one of the Labour tax policies I think specifically cover is a windfall tax, so tax on energy companies. So all things being equal, if energy companies have to pay more tax, or UK-based energy companies have to pay more tax, then the share price should, in theory, fall in value or not grow as much because of kind of the impact of that additional tax. Luxury goods manufacturers, Harrods selling handbags, etc. One of the things, and I'll mention this later, one of the tax proposals, which shouldn't really affect many of our clients, I wouldn't have thought, but is attacking non-doms and non-residents. So people that kind of are here but not fully here and only pay tax on UK money. And this is what Rishi Sunak's wife got in trouble for, is probably the right phrase, because she kept a non-dom status. So she paid tax money in the UK, but most of her money was overseas. So wasn't taxed on that money in the UK as the same way that somebody who was a UK domicile and resident would be. So essentially she's paying less UK tax. Labour Party's proposal is to remove that. And the idea is that if that has no impact, it won't affect the likes of Harrods selling handbags. But if those people don't want to be caught by that tax and then remove themselves from the UK and take their spending from the UK, that would affect, I say, luxury goods manufacturers and retailers in the UK. Water companies, I think you would be hard pressed not to have seen horror stories about sewage going into the rivers seemingly on a daily basis. Various horror stories of that. So again, is there increased regulation from Labour? Do they look to privatise water companies? So again, if you've got shares in water companies, does that have an impact in there? Railways, similar issues. They are talking about Great British Railway. Haven't read up fully on that, but if somebody's got a query on that, I can look into that. Construction will probably be one of the, I suppose, highlights of this, because if they're going to genuinely reform the planning rules and build another £1.5 million houses, maybe construction companies and involved in other projects do well. But as I said, that may already be priced in because people will be working this. It's difficult to think, but if it's common knowledge, then to some extent it will be in the price. And again, all of that, as I said, may be in the price already. Pensions, obviously, as financial advisors, a lot of our work is in the either at retirement, i.e. taking benefits, or the already enjoying retirement space. So pensions, generally, I would say it's good news, I think. The state pension triple lock has been protected by Labour. This is the principle that the state pension every year will go up by the higher of inflation, wage rises, or 2.5%. So if there's no inflation, no wage rises, you get 2.5%. If inflation or wage rises are higher than 2.5%, you get 2.5%. This is very good for anyone on state pension, and with inflation being higher the last couple of years, anyone who's already retired has seen the benefits of that. Lifetime allowance, for those that don't know what that is, that was it was scrapped by Jeremy Hunt earlier in the year, spring budget. It was essentially additional taxes on your pension once you went to a certain level. The level was just over £1 million. Jeremy Hunt scrapped it, albeit it did retain an element in terms of frozen tax-free cash limit. I'll mention that briefly in a moment. Labour originally were going to reintroduce it, and we got some clients at around about that £1 million pension level, so it did give us some issues. There's been proved problematic, I think, to reintroduce it because they were needing to exempt NHS consultants because the NHS pension scheme and the tax charges were giving them issues with recruitment and retention of consultants, and they've decided not to reintroduce it, so that's good news. Tax-free cash, it's a perennial question. Every time there is an election, and I've been through a few elections at Ready Turton, there are always a number of clients that say, well, okay, will the government, normally a Labour government coming in, they're concerned about, remove the right to 25% of your pension funds to the limit, which is 268,000 and change total tax-free cash, and will they remove your right to take that tax-free cash? There's no mention of it in the manifesto whatsoever. I think it's politically very difficult for the Labour Party to do that, because I think it I think there'd be uproar, really. If it was introduced, I think there would be an element of grandfathering and protection for existing tax-free cash things. To some extent, that's already been done for them anyway, by the Conservatives effectively having this 25% but capped at 268,000 and change. Lump sum allowance is a technical title. So I think the Conservatives have already done the job for them. What I suspect is, and I think Conservatives would have frozen it anyway, but I think Labour will probably keep that level frozen, will probably not increase it for a long time. And effectively, that will bring more money being taxable rather than tax-free. But I don't think it's an immediate concern for anyone. If you are concerned about it, you could look at taking your tax-free cash sooner rather than later. I personally think that's not necessary, but I don't know what could happen in the future. If it was my money, I wouldn't rush to do it, but I understand some people might want to do it. Inheritance tax on pensions, that's probably the biggest area of concern. Again, not in the manifesto at all, as I could see. They were denied that what somebody called a pension death tax is party policy. But it's worth pointing out that pension funds are generally exempt from inheritance tax, and that is therefore been used as an inheritance tax planning vehicle by ourselves and lots of other financial advisors, and is generally very welcome by our clients to pass money from one generation to another. That may get worse. What we do about it is a bit debatable, but it's certainly a thing that could get worse. There's no plans to do that as far as I know, but I do recall it was discussed previously by the Labour Party, so I don't think it's completely off the table. Private school fees, this has been in the news a lot. How many people does it affect? I mean, our clients, it affects a few, but not all. So what they're talking about, Labour, and this is almost certainly going to happen, they're talking about the removal of the VAT exemption or the imposition of 20% VAT, depending which side of the political fence you're on in this particular issue. Currently, private school fees are exempt from that, and also removing the business rates relief that private schools get. Both of those will effectively increase the cost of private school fees. It's worth pointing out, it probably doesn't mean there's a 20% increase in costs. Schools can reclaim some of their VAT on some of their own costs, presumably, other VAT or business can, so I can't see why they wouldn't be able to. And again, I think it's the IFS, they thought the fees might go up 15%, not 20%. That said, that's still probably enough to kind of nudge the dial for some people. I sent my eldest to private school for 2 years and mess up with his A-levels, basically. And if it was 15% more, it was stingy at the price it was, and 15% more may have made me reconsider. I probably still would have done it, but it would have made it tighter. So it certainly would have an impact. Some parents I'm speaking to, and certainly see a lot in the press, are looking at prepayments you pay for next year's fees or even several years' fees to avoid the VAT. I'm not certain whether it works or not. Seems to be some debate on that. But there are risks. Finally, you might need to revisit your financial planning. If your school fees are going to go up 15% and you've got a few more years to pay, is that affordable? Do you need to raise more money, spend less, earn more, whatever? The risks of prepaying, I'll run through this just very quickly. So this is the idea: you pay for school fees early in order to avoid the VAT. Well, first, it might not work. We're not sure when you need to pay it by, and there could be retroactive measures. If they would come in and say, listen, we know what you've done it to avoid the VAT, it's not impossible that they catch anyone from the date of the election or whatever it is. Liquidity risks. Do you want large sums tied up in prepaid fees? What if you need that money? You're in business and a supplier, defaults on payment to you, or so customer defaults, something like that. School closure. There's always schools closing now in the private sector, and that maybe get worse with the challenges due to VAT. Do you really want 2 or 3 years school fees tied up in a school that might not be there? Do you get your money back? Also, what if your circumstances change? What if the school's not right for your children or you move? And again, opportunity costs. There are risks of doing it. Private medical insurance. Again, nothing specifically in the budget, in the manifesto regarding this. But of course, the Labour is the party of the NHS. I think that's fair to say. It's kind of at their core. They've got a commitment to improve the NHS in lots of ways, and that may have an impact and a benefit in terms of private medical insurance. It may mean less demand for private medicine, so you're getting treated properly. So we've known certainly some clients and friends and people who effectively raided their savings to pay for hip operations, knee operations, etc., because they couldn't wait for the NHS and he didn't have private medical insurance. That essentially drives up the cost of private medicine, supply and demand. If those people suddenly in the NHS, obviously they've got more money themselves, which is I suppose a bonus, but also it means there's probably less demand for private medicines, and maybe the cost of private medicine calm down a bit, possibly, and then therefore you may have lower private medical insurance premiums, which is obviously good for anyone who's got private medical insurance. Alternatively, insurance premium tax isn't mentioned in the manifesto. There's no commitment not to increase it. And if they will come under financial pressure, maybe they increase insurance premium tax on health insurance in a similar way that they're putting VAT on private school fees. So you could argue that it's a benefit for wealthy people, and therefore politically maybe that's something they look to tax even more than they do at the moment. Business owners. Again, I would say that Labour manifesto is broadly okay, neutral, positive. I didn't read anything that concerned me as a business owner. They claim to be pro-business and party of wealth creation. Again, the Starmer's Labour is not Corbyn's Labour. I think it's fair to say. So I think it's realised it needs to be in that space to be electable. No corporation changes, but as I said, from a relatively high level. No increases to income tax, national insurance, VAT, again, relatively high level. Increased stability, the annual budgets, etc., to help better business planning. All of that is good, and I think I'd broadly welcome. Again, I mentioned earlier some concerns regarding increased workers' rights. Not the objective workers own decent rights. So obviously, we're a good employer and look after people. And again, similar thing with minimum wage reforms. But it might hamper businesses that are trying to grow to recruit new people or make them think twice. That may be negative in a sense of growth, which again won't help Labour's finances. Landlords. Labour's charter for renters, this seems to have gone a little bit quiet. This was Lisa Nandy a couple of years ago, promised that within 100 days, Labour would introduce their charter for renters. Let's first say it's not massively dissimilar from Michael Gove's Rent Reform Act, which I think think's gone by the way now with the election and everything. Essentially more red tape and cost and I suppose risk for landlords. Landlords are, I suppose, Labour is probably not the party of landlords. I think it's fair to say they're not the traditional match in that sense. And again, so that's probably a factor issue. If you're a landlord, you want to look at the market. in that sense, and whether it's still going to be tenable. I will say the manifesto has not mentioned this at all. It's not in there at all, but they could just say, well, it was previously committed to. So if it comes and goes, I don't know. Perhaps the bigger issue, or as big an issue, is this commitment or hope to build another 1.5 million houses. That will, in simple terms, increase in supply of housing, will put pressure on house prices and rents. So maybe that's a negative. Good, obviously, if you're renting, not so good if you're a landlord. Non-doms and non-residents, I mentioned that earlier. So the non-dom status is effectively being ended. So somebody like Rishi Sunak's wife, who's now ended her non-dom status, previously she could have kept a non-dom status, paid tax only on UK money, kept money outside UK and paid less tax in effect. If you're going to pay less tax by moving to UK, you wouldn't keep your status, you do it anyway. Similarly, they're talking about ending offshore trusts. So it's a similar principle. It's whereby, again, your money's offshore, but you're in the UK. It doesn't really work. Well, I don't think it works at all for UK residents, UK domiciles. It's a non-dom, non-resident thing. An extra 1% stamp duty on non-UK residents. This is overseas residents buying UK property. I doubt it has much impact in Leicester, but in terms of the London property market, probably a factor. In conclusion, for those of us old enough to remember Dad's Army and Private Jones and Captain Mannering and all that stuff, Richie perhaps should have remembered that and not skip the D-Day celebrations. Might have helped his polling. Don't panic, don't panic. The Labour's tax plans, confirmed by almost anyone, are relatively, benign. They do increase the overall tax take, I think. But it's from a high base, so it's a little bit more. Not that anyone wants to pay more tax. I don't want to pay more tax, but it's not going from it's not going from a high base to a super high base, and it's not going from a very low base to a high base. So I think in real world, I don't think we see any immediate impact of that. Equally, the spending commitments are relatively modest. It's all pinned on growth, really, in that sense. In terms of what you might want to do. Again, investments, I think a lot of this stuff is oversold in the sense of, is there an issue? But it makes sense to review your investment portfolios and, well, both what assets you hold and maybe to some extent where they're held, capital gains tax, etc., which come on. Capital gains tax, again, make use of allowances. I wouldn't rush to do much more than that, but maybe if you could pay tax at 10% capital gains, the old entrepreneurs relief, which is now business disposal relief, maybe that could go possibly. And certainly I've got some company clients selling businesses that may look to get that over the line before the new government kind of gets its feet under the table and changes anything. I wouldn't necessarily sell it just for that reason, but if I was selling anyway, maybe I'd look to move it forward perhaps. Inheritance tax, maybe make gifts earlier, maybe look at buying exempt assets. One of the things that the government could look at attacking are primarily agricultural relief and business relief schemes. These are of agricultural property. The idea that you own certain assets, and if you own them for normally 2 years, you're exempt from inheritance tax. And we use them a lot for clients, are very popular. There was a lot of talk that the government could, or Labour's coming in, could get rid of them. They could do that in a number of ways. They could extend the holding period from 2 years to 5 or 10, which would make them less attractive. They could effectively ban them completely, i.e. you get no inheritance tax from that. There's a couple of things they could do. They could restrict the category of things that qualify and don't qualify. Again, not certain what would happen. If you own them now or buy them in advance of those changes, maybe they would be grandfathered and protected, maybe not. But again, if you've got an inheritance tax, probably might want to do that. Similar thing with gifts. They might extend how long you have to give the gift. Currently it's 7 years and it's tax-free generally. And then we could extend that to 10 years, 14 years, who knows? Again, you make a gift now, maybe it's on the clock, maybe it's beneficial. And what I would say is if you've got an inheritance tax problem, and you've got children who've got their children, i.e. your grandchildren at school fees, and they're looking to prepay to avoid VAT, maybe you give them the money now, so it's on the clock for inheritance tax. Maybe that saves you more inheritance tax by doing it sooner, especially if Labour do change the rules. And maybe you can prepay and avoid the VAT. So maybe there's like a double win from a tax angle. How can early return help? Okay, hopefully by helping you understand your own financial planning picture, which I think is fine, calculating how much you need for the future, and then that ties into gifting money to kids and grandkids and stuff like that. We work in conjunction with other experts for an overall financial plan and helping you navigate a complicated or complex financial world, which is likely to get more complicated. fundamentally helping you enjoy your wealth, and I suppose your children if we're passing it forward. Martin mentioned, I think mentioned at the start, we work with a guy called Paul Armson, in terms of financial planning kind of approaches. He's got a book called Enough. Anyone who's attended that, if you email martin@readyturn.com with your home address or office address, I suppose, we will drop you a copy in the post so you can see kind of how we work. Questions and answers. That's it. Just 1 second. See what we've got.
Scott, thank you very much for all of that. That's a whistle-stop tour through what we think might happen with the what we assume to be the new incoming Labour government. Important to say that in the past, some incoming governments or hopeful incoming governments have emphasised action on the first day, a budget in the first day of the first week. But the Labour Party have said no such thing. They've emphasised, as Scott said a minute ago, stability, annual budget, not chopping and changing. Now, we don't know when the first budget or when any first changes might be, but we think they're not going to be immediate. And frankly, some of the changes we've talked about today are things which are complex and they do take time. So really what we're doing is we're looking into the future a bit, and we won't know the true picture for quite a while. So just to bring that round to what might be important to you and what we do here for our clients is that we also look into the future for clients, and we emphasise personal financial planning, modelling your future, working out whether you will achieve your objectives and what your financial future may look like. So we will be getting in contact with all of you over the next few days by email with a copy of the slides and an invitation to come and speak to us, have a cup of coffee and a biscuit, and see if we can help you in that sense. In the meantime, though, some of you will have questions about what Scott has said today, so I'll pick up a few of those. Richard emailed, even before we started the presentation, in actual fact, to ask something which I think Scott has already dealt with, which is he asked the 25% you can take off your pension as a tax-free lump sum, which is loved by a lot of people. It's a great big lump sum of money as soon as you retire. Will Labour remove that, and should I take the money immediately before the Labour can take it away from me? Just to paraphrase what Scott said 5 minutes ago, he said that although that's a possibility, he thought it was unlikely, at least in the short term, and that what we think is most likely, we're not sure, what we think is most likely is that the Labour will leave it in place, but just let it erode away by keeping the limits where they are as inflation and values go up and up and up. So we can't be sure for definite, but it will be a very hot political potato and would create an awful lot of bad feeling in the public. So we think probably that's not one of the key things to be concerned about. Hope that's helpful, Richard. If not, please get in touch and we can talk about it some more. A couple of other questions here. Someone here has asked, Elaine has asked something we haven't mentioned yet, and perhaps you could speak about this, Scott, which is an important part of government and public policy for years, something that's been kicked around in the political football, is expenses for long-term care, which can strip away a lot of our wealth in our older years. Do we know what an incoming Labour government, if we get one, of course, has to say about that?
Good question. No, I don't actually. I didn't come across that in the manifesto. I suspect the reality is that it will be kicked further down the road. I remember spending a lot of time, 2010, I think it was, writing about Gordon Brown's National Care Service. It was equivalent to then NHS, but for care, where the government would pay for it. I think the reality is, that's definitely a political hot potato. The government won't want to pay for people's care, and financially, I think they're going to struggle. And of course, we don't want to pay for care for our parents in terms of them losing their house. But fundamentally, the money either comes from the taxpayer or the people with the assets. Us as taxpayers don't want to pay it. And I think, so I'll be honest, I will be surprised if it's really tackled. I don't know what the policy is, but I suspect it's just kicked further down the road, which doesn't help anybody. I think Ed Davey did, Lib Dems, to be fair, they have actually got a proper policy on it. Whether it works or not, probably also debatable, but I can't see Lib Dems winning. So I think we'll still be talking about this in the future.
Okay, well, Scott, maybe we'll talk about that at a further seminar. Maybe we'll address it again. Another question, this is something perhaps we might know a little bit more, which is Craig says that he's a small business owner and he pays himself and his wife through a combination of salary and dividends. He says some people regard this as I think it's on the edge of tax planning, but I think it's just common sense. I think he means sort of paying himself dividends rather than salary. Is there any suggestion that small business owners who pay themselves in a tax efficient way might see their tax going up?
Again, great question. I did look at detailing this in the manifesto actually, and again, despite in parts Labour being very pro or claiming to be pro-business, and the party of wealth creation, which is obviously good, I struggled to find a specific reference to the word small business anywhere in their 130-page manifesto. So it seems to be overlooked. Business just seems to be business. I think it's a grey area. They've said no increase in income tax, but we've known before. I think the Conservatives previously said no increase in income tax and increased dividends. So it's a tax on income, same as I think governments previously have done with national insurance, the same problem. There's no proposal to increase it. I think it's in that grey area of, is it covered by the no increase to income tax? Possibly. Or is it in the other taxes that they haven't committed to? I think a lot would be hinging on, I don't think they're going to increase it tomorrow or whatever on July 5th. But I certainly think they will reserve the option to increase it if they need to, because it's this grey area. If they did increase it, it would be difficult to argue that it was specifically excluded by their manifesto, but it is very silent on that point. It did not say income tax, including dividend tax, would not be increased, and dividend tax, I couldn't find a reference to it at all. So I think it's potentially on the table.
Thank you, Scott. One of our clients, Dave, makes the point that he and his wife are like to be tax savvy, and they make the maximum use of their ISA allowances each year because it's a most common way of sheltering money from taxes. Is it likely to be in jeopardy, either the existing money or future contributions, to save tax in this way?
Well, I think it's always possible. Again, not specifically protected by the manifesto that I could see. In fact, the Conservatives were going the other way around with their British ISA. It was effectively increasing the ISA limit to 25,000. I'm pretty sure Labour aren't doing that. I've always been surprised at the ISA allowance, and we make full use of it for our clients. It's a great, if you're not making full use of it and you've got the money, then you'll miss a trip. But I have always been surprised at how generous it is. And I do think that the tax impact of it, especially now interest rates are higher, I think it's an area that I wouldn't be surprised if a Labour government eventually looked at it. Again, it's one of the things that politically is quite difficult to attack in a sense, albeit it was done before when they changed dividend tax rules. So again, I don't think it's off the table, but I think the view is to put your money into ISAs whilst you can, in the hope that if they were attacked, that any money in there might be protected. That's certainly one of the easy wins, to just reduce the ISA allowance moving forward. Less politically damaging because you're not hitting anyone who's already got one. You're only hitting people paying into one in the future. And typically how government policy works is to not annoy the people who've already done something and to go after people that might do it in the future on the grounds they haven't already done it, so they can't really complain.
Thank you, Scott. That's interesting. And that aspect of whether rules will be retrospective, affect people who've done actions in the past, is an important one. And it's something important to say that normally when there are changes in financial planning, especially in pensions, which Scott and I have seen over many years, normally there are protections to protect people who've taken action in good faith in the past. Transitional regimes, they're normally referred to as. So when we talk about changes, if you've already got things in place, there's a good chance that the rules might not affect you. Now, I'm conscious it's almost 10 to, the football starts in 10 minutes, so many of you will be gearing up for that. I think we've got time for one more question. Matthew asked, regarding pensions, is there a proposed change to the maximum amount that can be contributed to a pension per tax year? Currently, the limit is £60,000 each. Have we got any information on that, Scott, I wonder?
No, again, I didn't see anything on that. I think the 60k from memory was a temporary limit. I think it was brought in for this year and maybe next year. So logically, you would expect that was allowed to naturally kind of drop back to the 40k. Again, worth pointing out that even on the 40k limit, this principle of fiscal drag, i.e. the allowances are frozen or not re-rated to inflation, has an impact. So if you think about it, I don't know, we've had about 20% inflation, I think it is, cumulatively over the last couple of years. It's stinging when you add it up. Well, effectively, in order to keep pace with the 40,000 limit, as is now a few years ago, that will now need to be almost 50,000. So, okay, the 60 is ahead, But if it then drops back to 40,000, that in real terms is a cut of nearly 10. So I think that's an element of where the pension rules will go. That, you know, that high inflation we've had for a few years, that fiscal drag is actually hugely beneficial for the government's coffers, and I think that fiscal drag will be used more than anything else.
Thank you very much, Scott. That's interesting. Now, I think we're to the end of our questions now, so it only remains me to thank everybody who attended today, who watched us, to say that we'd like to see more of you. So as I said before, we'll be getting in touch over the next few days and hopefully make contact with a few people we haven't met before. We're very glad to help and to talk to you about your own financial planning, whatever the government today does. So thank you very much, and perhaps we'll see you again the next time we present one of these seminars. Until then, thank you again. Bye-bye.